He thought the badge made him untouchable, but he never asked who he was touching. The afternoon sun hung low over the city, casting long golden shadows across the pavement as traffic crawled through the busy intersection on Maple Avenue, horns faintly echoing between brick buildings and glass storefronts. The kind of ordinary weekday scene where nothing remarkable was supposed to happen, where people kept their heads down and moved on with their lives. But that was before the sirens cut through the air, sharp and commanding, turning heads and slowing footsteps as a patrol car rolled to a sudden stop along the curb, its lights flashing red and blue against the reflective windows. And from it stepped Officer Daniel Brooks, his posture rigid, his expression already set in quiet judgment as his eyes locked onto a man walking calmly along the sidewalk. Marcus Reed, dressed in a simple navy jacket and dark jeans, hands relaxed at his sides, his pace steady, unhurried, as if he had nowhere to prove himself and nothing to hide. Yet something about him drew attention, not because he was loud or disruptive, but because he carried himself with a stillness that didn't match the assumptions forming in Daniel's mind. And within seconds, that assumption turned into action. "Hey, you, stop right there." Daniel's voice cut through the noise of the street, firm and unmistakable, causing nearby pedestrians to pause, some slowing just enough to watch without getting involved, others instinctively stepping back as if distance could keep them safe from whatever was about to unfold. Marcus stopped, slowly turning to face the officer, his expression calm, eyes steady, not defiant, not submissive, just present, as if he had seen this moment before, as if he already understood how it would play out. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice even, controlled. But Daniel didn't answer the question, not directly. Instead, he stepped closer, scanning Marcus from head to toe, the way someone looks when they've already decided what they're going to see before they even look. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," Daniel said, though his tone suggested the report had less to do with facts and more to do with instinct, the kind of instinct shaped by something deeper than evidence, something Marcus recognized immediately, but didn't react to, not outwardly. "I was just walking," Marcus replied, his voice steady, but the explanation seemed to bounce off Daniel without landing. "Yeah, that's what they all say," Daniel muttered, louder this time, just enough for the growing crowd to hear. And now phones were coming out, small black rectangles held up like silent witnesses, recording not just what was happening, but how it was happening, the shift in tone, the tightening in Daniel's posture, the subtle but unmistakable edge in his voice. Marcus noticed it too. Of course he did, but he didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't escalate. Instead, he stood there, grounded, his breathing slow, his gaze unwavering. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said, and for a brief moment, there was a pause, a space where things could have gone differently, where the situation could have de-escalated, but Daniel stepped forward again, closing that space. "Turn around," he ordered, his voice sharper now, final. And the murmurs from the crowd grew louder, not loud enough to intervene, but loud enough to acknowledge that something felt off, something didn't sit right, and Marcus hesitated, not out of fear, but out of understanding that once this line was crossed, it wouldn't be easy to step back. "Officer, I think you're making a mistake," he said quietly, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in Daniel's expression, not doubt, but irritation, as if the calmness in Marcus's voice challenged the narrative he had already built in his head. "Turn around," Daniel repeated, more forcefully, and this time, Marcus slowly complied, not because he agreed, but because he chose control over chaos, because he understood timing, because he knew something Daniel didn't, something no one in that growing circle of onlookers could see yet. And as the sound of handcuffs clicked into place, a subtle shift moved through the air, almost imperceptible, like the calm before a storm, and Marcus, standing there in the fading sunlight, said just one sentence, low, enough that only Daniel could hear. "You might want to call your captain." The words barely left Marcus Reed's lips before the air around them shifted, subtle at first, like a change in pressure you could feel but not explain, and Officer Daniel Brooks froze for half a second, just long enough for doubt to flicker behind his eyes, but not long enough for him to admit it, not even to himself. "You do not give orders here," Daniel replied, his voice tightening as he guided Marcus toward the patrol car. each step deliberate, each movement louder now under the weight of the watching crowd. The hum of whispered conversations rising as phones continued to record, capturing every angle, every word, every expression that might matter later, and Marcus did not resist. He did not argue. He simply walked, his posture straight, his expression composed, as if he had already accepted the moment but not surrendered to it. As if this was just one step in something much larger than the scene unfolding on Maple Avenue. And that calm unsettled Daniel more than any protest ever could, because it did not fit the script he was used to. It did not match the reactions he expected, and yet he pushed forward anyway, opening the rear door of the patrol car with a sharp motion. "Get in," he said, and Marcus paused for just a fraction of a second before stepping inside, not slowly, not reluctantly, but with intention, as though he was choosing to enter rather than being forced. And as the door closed with a solid click, the sound echoed louder than it should have, sealing the moment in a way that felt final to everyone watching, except Marcus, who leaned back against the seat, his eyes drifting briefly to the window where reflections of flashing lights danced across the glass. And for a brief moment, the noise outside faded, replaced by something quieter, something internal, a memory perhaps, or a calculation. Something that did not show on his face but lived just beneath the surface. Outside, Daniel adjusted his uniform, glancing once at the crowd, noticing the phones, the attention, the silent judgment that now pointed in his direction, and it irritated him, not because he thought he was wrong, but because he was not used to being questioned, not even silently. He slid into the driver's seat, the radio crackling faintly as he reached for it, his hand hovering for a moment before pressing the button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 23. I have one in custody," he said, his tone controlled, professional, but there was something underneath it now, something less certain than before. "Copy that, Unit 23. The voice responded, routine, distant, unaware of the tension sitting in the car, unaware of the words that had just been spoken in a lower voice moments earlier. Daniel pulled away from the curb, merging back into traffic, the sirens now off. The flashing lights dimmed, but the weight of the situation remained, sitting between him and the man in the back seat, unspoken but undeniable, and for a few blocks, there was silence, the kind that stretches, the kind that forces thoughts to grow louder. And Daniel found himself glancing in the rearview mirror more often than necessary, each time meeting the same steady gaze, calm, unshaken, almost patient. And it began to feel less like he was transporting a suspect and more like he was being observed, measured, and that thought irritated him even more. "You think you are smart, huh?" Daniel said finally, breaking the silence, his voice edged with frustration. But Marcus did not respond immediately. He simply looked out the window for a moment, watching the city pass by, people crossing streets, cars stopping at lights, life continuing as if nothing had changed. And then he spoke, quietly. "I think you are making a decision you cannot undo." And that sentence landed differently. Not loud, not aggressive, but heavy, like something that carried weight beyond the moment. And Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw setting as he focused on the road ahead. But the words stayed with him, repeating, echoing, not because they were threatening, but because they felt certain. And certainty was something Daniel was used to having. Not something he expected to hear from the back seat. They pulled into the station parking lot a few minutes later, the building standing tall and familiar, a place where Daniel usually felt in control, where the lines were clear and the authority unquestioned. But today, as he stepped out of the car and walked around to open the back door, something felt different, something subtle but persistent, like the beginning of a realization he was not ready to face. "Out," he said, and Marcus stepped out once again without resistance, his eyes scanning the building for a brief moment before returning to Daniel. Calm as ever. "Last chance," Marcus said quietly, not as a challenge, not as a warning, but as a fact. "Call your captain." And this time, Daniel did not respond right away, his hand hovering near his radio again, the same hesitation creeping back, stronger now, more noticeable. But still, he pushed it aside, choosing routine over doubt, choosing authority over instinct. And as he led Marcus toward the station doors, neither of them noticed the unmarked black SUV turning slowly into the parking lot behind them, its windows dark, its presence quiet, but its timing exact. The station doors opened with a muted mechanical hum, and the moment Marcus Reed stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted again, quieter than the street, but heavier in a different way. The fluorescent lights casting a pale glow across polished floors and cluttered desks where officers moved through routine tasks, typing reports, answering calls, exchanging brief words that carried no emotion beyond habit. Yet as Daniel Brooks guided Marcus forward, conversations began to slow, not stop entirely, but enough to create a subtle ripple of awareness, the kind that spreads without being announced. And Marcus felt it. Of course he did. But his expression did not change. His shoulders remained relaxed, his pace steady, as if this place, this building meant to contain authority, held no power over him at all. Daniel led him toward the processing desk, his movements sharper now, more deliberate, as if trying to reassert control over something he could not quite define. "I have got one for processing," he said, his voice louder than necessary, drawing attention from a few nearby officers. One of them, a middle-aged sergeant named Collins, glanced up from his paperwork, his eyes moving from Daniel to Marcus, pausing just a second longer than usual, not in recognition, not yet, but in curiosity. "What is the charge?" Collins asked, his tone neutral, but Daniel hesitated, just briefly, before answering. "Suspicious behavior, possible theft." The words sounded less certain as they left his mouth, as if even he could hear the weakness in them. Collins raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting back to Marcus, who stood there calmly, meeting his eyes without challenge, without fear, just a quiet presence that did not align with the situation being described. And for a moment, Collins seemed like he might ask another question, but instead he nodded slowly, returning to his paperwork, choosing procedure over instinct. Daniel turned back to Marcus, gesturing toward a chair. "Sit," he said, and Marcus complied without resistance, lowering himself into the seat with the same composed demeanor he had carried from the street, his hands resting lightly in front of him, his posture upright, as if he were waiting for something specific rather than reacting to what was happening. The room continued to move around them, phones ringing, printers humming, footsteps echoing faintly in the background. But there was an undercurrent now, something unspoken, a tension that lingered just beneath the surface, and Daniel felt it. Though he could not name it, he moved behind the desk, beginning the standard process, entering information into the system, each keystroke louder in his own ears than it should have been. "Name?" he asked without looking up. "Marcus Reed," came the calm reply. Daniel typed it in, the screen flickering as the system processed the input, and for a split second, something unusual appeared, a delay longer than expected, a brief pause that caused Daniel's fingers to hover over the keyboard. But then it cleared, replaced by a blank entry field. Nothing flagged, nothing obvious, and yet the hesitation lingered. "Date of birth," Daniel continued, his voice tighter now. Marcus answered, steady as before, and again Daniel entered the information. Again the system paused, just for a moment, just long enough to be noticed if you were paying attention. And this time Daniel frowned slightly, glancing at the screen, then back at Marcus, then back at the screen, as if trying to convince himself it was nothing, just a slow system, just a glitch. But Marcus watched him quietly, not with amusement, not with arrogance, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what was coming next, and that certainty began to press against Daniel's thoughts, making it harder to ignore the voice in the back of his mind, the one that had started on the street, the one that had grown louder with every passing minute. "You still have time," Marcus said softly, his voice cutting through the noise of the room without raising in volume, and Daniel looked up sharply, irritation flashing across his face. "Stop talking," he snapped, but the sharpness in his tone felt thinner now, less grounded, as if it was holding together something that was beginning to crack. And before he could continue, the front doors of the station opened again, the sound drawing attention from across the room as two figures stepped inside, dressed in dark suits, their presence immediate and unmistakable, not because they were loud, but because they did not need to be. The room responded to them in a way that had nothing to do with rank displayed on a uniform and everything to do with authority that did not need to announce itself. Conversation slowed further, heads turned, and Sergeant Collins looked up again, this time with recognition, his posture straightening almost instantly, and Daniel followed his gaze, his eyes landing on the two men as they walked forward with measured steps. Their expressions composed, their focus direct, and for the first time since the sirens had sounded on Maple Avenue, Daniel Brooks felt something he had not expected to feel that day. Uncertainty that could no longer be ignored, because the men were not looking at the room. They were not scanning the desks or acknowledging the officers around them. They were walking straight toward Marcus Reed. The footsteps echoed across the station floor with a rhythm that did not belong to the usual chaos of ringing phones and shuffling paperwork. And as the two men in dark suits moved closer, the atmosphere tightened in a way that no one could ignore. Conversations fading into silence not because anyone was told to stop, but because something unspoken demanded attention, and Sergeant Collins straightened fully now, setting his pen down with deliberate care as recognition settled across his face. "Agents," he said under his breath, almost instinctively, and that single word carried further than it should have, reaching Daniel Brooks where he stood behind the desk, his hands hovering over the keyboard, his eyes shifting from the screen to the approaching figures, his posture stiffening as uncertainty turned into something heavier, something harder to push aside. The two men stopped just a few feet from Marcus Reed, their presence calm but commanding. One of them, taller, with silver at his temples, glanced briefly at Marcus before turning his gaze to Daniel. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, controlled, but carried an authority that did not need to raise itself. "Officer, I believe you have someone here who does not belong in your custody." The words were simple, but they landed with precision, cutting through the tension that had been building since the moment the sirens first sounded. And Daniel felt his throat tighten slightly, not visibly, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough for him to notice, enough for him to realize that the situation was no longer within his control. "He was detained for suspicious behavior," Daniel replied, forcing his voice to remain even, professional, but there was a thin edge to it now, something defensive, something searching for ground that was no longer stable. The taller agent nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "I understand what you believe you observed," he said, his tone measured, "but I need you to remove the restraints." And the room seemed to hold its breath, officers at nearby desks pausing just enough to listen without appearing to listen, their attention drawn to the quiet shift of power happening in real time. Daniel hesitated, his hand lowering slightly from the desk, his eyes flickering toward Marcus, who remained seated, calm as ever, his expression unchanged, as if this moment had already been written long before any of them arrived. "On what authority?" Daniel asked. And this time, the second agent stepped forward slightly, his gaze sharper, his voice firm. "Federal authority," he said, reaching into his jacket and presenting a badge, the metal catching the overhead light in a brief flash that seemed brighter than it should have been, and Daniel's eyes locked onto it, his mind racing to process what he was seeing, what he had missed, what he had ignored. And in that moment, everything Marcus had said began to echo back, not as a warning, but as a fact he had chosen not to hear. "You might want to call your captain." The words replayed in his head, heavier now, undeniable, and Daniel swallowed, his hand moving slowly toward Marcus, the tension in his fingers betraying the shift in his confidence. As he unlocked the restraints with a soft metallic click that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room, Marcus stood up smoothly, adjusting his jacket with a calm, deliberate motion, his posture unchanged, his presence now filling the space in a way that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with truth. Finally stepping into the light, the taller agent turned slightly toward him, his tone respectful. "Agent Reed," he said, and that was the moment it fully landed, not just for Daniel, but for everyone within earshot. The name no longer just a name entered into a system, but a title, a role, a reality that shifted everything that had come before, and Daniel felt it, the weight of it pressing down on his chest, not physically, but enough to make his next breath feel different. "We have been expecting your update," the agent continued, and Marcus nodded once, his eyes briefly scanning the room, taking in the officers, the desks, the quiet faces that now avoided direct contact, and then his gaze returned to Daniel, steady, not angry, not vengeful, just clear. "This was part of it," Marcus said, his voice calm, but now carrying a depth that had been hidden in plain sight. And Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came, because for the first time that day, he was no longer the one defining the situation. He was standing inside it, and the realization settled in slowly, like a shadow stretching across the floor, impossible to ignore, impossible to step out of. And as the agents turned slightly, preparing to move forward, the quiet authority they carried now reshaping the entire room, Daniel Brooks stood still, the badge on his chest unchanged, but the meaning behind it suddenly heavier than it had ever felt before. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, heavy with realization, as if the entire station had collectively stepped into a moment no one could rewind. And Marcus Reed stood there, no longer just a man pulled in from the street, but a presence that reshaped the space around him without raising his voice or changing his posture, while the two federal agents remained at his side, their calm authority anchoring the shift that had just taken place. And Daniel Brooks felt it more than anyone, the weight of every decision he had made replaying in his mind, not as flashes of action, but as choices, small moments where he could have paused, could have listened, could have seen beyond assumption, and yet he had not. Agent Reed. The taller agent continued, his tone respectful but focused. We have been monitoring this district for several weeks. And the words settled into the room like pieces of a puzzle finally revealing their shape. Patterns of conduct, repeated. Complaints, internal inconsistencies, he added, glancing briefly towards Sergeant Collins, who now stood fully attentive, his earlier neutrality replaced by a growing awareness of what was unfolding. Marcus nodded slightly, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharp, observant. And today, Marcus said quietly, we have confirmation. And that sentence did not need elaboration. It did not need explanation, because the meaning was already clear to everyone who heard it, especially Daniel, whose breath felt tighter now, whose thoughts raced faster, searching for something solid to hold on to, but finding nothing that could undo what had already been set in motion. This is not just about one stop, Marcus continued, his voice calm but steady, carrying across the room without effort. This is about a pattern, about decisions made without evidence, about authority used without accountability. And no one interrupted, no one challenged him, because the tone was not accusatory, it was factual, and facts have a way of settling deeper than accusations ever could. Daniel shifted slightly, his hands moving at his sides, not knowing where to rest, not knowing how to stand in a moment where the ground beneath him had changed without warning. I was assigned to observe, Marcus said, his gaze briefly moving across the room before returning to Daniel, to see what happens when no one thinks they are being watched. And that line hung in the air longer than any of the others, because it did not just describe what had happened, it exposed it, stripped it down to its simplest truth. And Daniel felt that truth press against him, not as a shout, but as a quiet certainty he could not argue with. The second agent stepped forward slightly, addressing the room now. From this point forward, this matter will be handled at the federal level, he said, his voice firm but controlled. We will be reviewing all related reports, all associated conduct, and all prior incidents connected to this case. And with each word, the scope widened, no longer confined to the moment on Maple Avenue, no longer limited to a single decision, but expanding into something far larger, something that reached beyond one officer, beyond one station, and into a system that had operated without question for too long. Sergeant Collins nodded slowly, absorbing the information, his earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet acceptance of the authority now present in the room. While other officers avoided eye contact entirely, their focus shifting back to desks, screens, anything that allowed them to step away from the center of what was unfolding. But Daniel could not step away, not physically, not mentally. He stood there, facing Marcus, facing the consequence of a moment he had believed was routine. You said I had time. Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower now, less certain, and Marcus met his gaze, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something more measured, something almost reflective. You always do, Marcus replied, his tone steady. The question is whether you use it. And there was no accusation in his voice, no need for it, because the answer was already visible, already understood. The taller agent glanced at Marcus once more, then nodded. "We should proceed," he said, and Marcus gave a slight nod in return, his attention shifting forward as the moment moved from revelation to action. And as they turned to walk further into the station, the quiet authority they carried did not need to be announced. It was felt, deeply, by everyone present. But Daniel remained where he was, the badge still on his chest, the uniform unchanged, yet everything about what it represented now felt different, heavier, as if for the first time, he was beginning to understand that authority without awareness was not strength, it was exposure, and that realization settled in slowly, not as a sudden shock, but as a truth that would not leave once it arrived. The movement deeper into the station did not come with raised voices or hurried steps. It came with a quiet certainty that reshaped everything in its path. And as Marcus Reed walked beside the two federal agents, the hallway seemed longer than it had before, each step echoing softly against the tiled floor, while doors on either side remained closed, as if the building itself was holding its breath. And behind them, Officer Daniel Brooks followed, not because he was told to, but because something inside him needed to see where this was going, needed to understand what had just begun. The agents led Marcus into a secured office near the back, a space rarely used except for internal reviews, and as the door opened, the room revealed a table, a set of chairs, and a screen already powered on, displaying files that had not been there minutes ago. And that detail did not go unnoticed. Marcus stepped inside first, his eyes scanning the room with familiarity, not curiosity, as if he had already been here in another form, in another role, long before today. The taller agent gestured toward the screen. "Everything has been compiled," he said, and Marcus nodded once, stepping closer, his gaze focused, precise, while Daniel lingered near the doorway, uncertain whether he was supposed to enter or remain outside. But no one told him to leave, and no one invited him in, leaving him suspended in a space between roles, between authority and accountability. Over the past 3 months, the second agent began, his voice calm but deliberate. "We have documented multiple stops within this district that followed the same pattern." He tapped the screen lightly, and images appeared, timestamps, locations, names, not random, not isolated, but connected, each one building on the last, forming a pattern that was no longer invisible. Marcus watched in silence, his expression steady, absorbing each detail not as new information, but as confirmation of what he had already seen, already understood. Each case showed a similar sequence. The agent continued. Initial stop. Without clear cause. Escalation based on assumption, and no verifiable outcome to justify the action. And the words were not spoken with anger. They were spoken with clarity, the kind that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. Daniel shifted slightly at the doorway, his eyes drawn to the screen despite himself, recognizing locations, remembering moments, not in full detail, but enough to feel the connection forming, enough to realize that what he had considered routine was now being reframed as something else entirely, something larger, something measurable. Today was not an isolated incident, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying through the room without force. It was consistent, and that word landed heavily, because consistency does not happen by accident. It happens through repetition, through habit, through decisions made again and again until they no longer feel like decisions at all. The taller agent turned slightly toward Daniel now, his gaze direct but not hostile. "Officer Brooks," he said, and hearing his name spoken in that tone, in that context, felt different. Daniel straightened instinctively, stepping just inside the room now, drawn into the conversation whether he was ready or not. "You are part of this review," the agent continued, not as a conclusion, but as a subject. And that distinction mattered, not an accusation, not yet, but not an exclusion either. And Daniel nodded slowly, though the movement felt heavier than it should have, as if acknowledging something he could not yet fully grasp. Marcus turned slightly, facing him now, and for the first time, there was a pause in the room, a moment where everything slowed just enough for the weight of the situation to settle completely. "Do you remember the first time you made a stop like this?" Marcus asked, his tone calm, almost reflective, and the question was unexpected, not because it was difficult, but because it required something Daniel had not considered, not in this way, not with this perspective. He opened. his mouth slightly, then closed it, his eyes dropping briefly as he searched his memory, not for a report, not for a file, but for a moment, a decision, a choice, and nothing came clearly, not one instance, not one defining moment, just a series of actions that had blended together over time. That is how it happens, Marcus said quietly, not waiting for an answer. It does not start as a pattern, it becomes one. And the room fell silent again, not empty, but full of that realization, full of the understanding that what had unfolded on Maple Avenue was not just a mistake, not just a moment, but part of something that had been building long before either of them stood on that street. And as the screen continued to display the collected evidence, the timestamps, the repeated sequences, Daniel Brooks stood there, no longer looking at a situation he could control, but at a reflection of decisions he had made without ever stopping to question where they might lead. The room did not move, but everything inside it shifted as the weight of what had been revealed settled deeper into every corner. And Marcus Reed stood near the screen, his eyes steady on the data not because he needed to study it, but because it represented something far more important than numbers and timestamps. It represented truth that had been overlooked, repeated, and allowed to grow unnoticed, while behind him, Officer Daniel Brooks remained still, his posture no longer rigid with authority but caught somewhere between defense and reflection, his eyes tracing the lines on the screen as if searching for something that could separate him from what he was seeing. But the pattern did not allow for that distance. It did not isolate. It connected, and that connection was becoming impossible to ignore. "There is something else," the taller agent said, his voice breaking the silence with calm precision as he tapped a key, and the screen changed again, new files appearing, internal communications, brief reports, notes that had never escalated beyond routine review, and Marcus shifted slightly, his attention sharpening, not surprised, but focused, because this was the layer beneath the pattern, the part that explained how it continued. Several of these incidents were flagged. The agent continued, not formally, but enough to be noticed. His eyes moved briefly toward Daniel, not accusing, not judging, just presenting. And each time, they were cleared without further review. And that sentence landed differently, because it extended beyond action into system, beyond individual into structure, and Daniel felt that extension immediately, his mind moving through memories of brief conversations, quick dismissals, moments where things were noted but not pursued. And for the first time, those moments did not feel small. They felt connected. "Do you understand what that means?" Marcus asked quietly, turning now to face him fully, and the question was not rhetorical. It was not meant to corner or pressure. It was meant to open something, to bring awareness where there had been assumption. Daniel hesitated, his gaze shifting from Marcus to the screen and back again, his thoughts moving slower now, heavier. "It means it was not just me," he said finally, his voice lower, uncertain, and Marcus held his gaze for a moment. Before responding, "It means it was allowed." And that distinction settled deeper, because being part of something and allowing something are not the same, but they lead to the same result, and Daniel felt that difference in a way he had not expected. The second agent stepped forward slightly, his tone steady. "This is where accountability changes," he said, not just identifying what happened, but understanding how it continued. And as he spoke, another file opened on the screen, this one, showing footage, not dramatic, not chaotic, just moments, brief interactions captured from body cameras, from street cameras, from angles that showed not just what happened, but how it happened, the tone, the posture, the words chosen, the assumptions made. And Marcus watched carefully, not with judgment, but with clarity, seeing the same patterns he had observed in person now reflected in recorded detail. While Daniel stood there, watching himself in fragments, hearing his own voice in a way that felt distant and immediate at the same time, and something in his expression began to shift, not outwardly, not dramatically, but enough to show that the certainty he once carried was no longer intact. "You said earlier that I had time," Daniel said quietly, his voice almost measured now, as if choosing each word with more care than before, and Marcus nodded slightly. "You did," he replied, and Daniel's eyes lowered for a moment, not in defeat, but in thought, in processing something he had never been forced to confront like this. "And now," Daniel continued, lifting his gaze again. "I am standing here because I did not use it." And there was no resistance in his voice now, no attempt to redirect or defend, just a statement, simple and direct, and the room remained still, not reacting, not interrupting, allowing the moment to exist fully, because this was no longer about proving a point, it was about recognizing one. Marcus studied him for a second longer, then gave a slight nod, not approval, not agreement, but acknowledgement, and the taller agent glanced between them before speaking again. "The review will continue," he said, his tone returning to procedure, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "And your cooperation will be noted." And Daniel nodded once. The movement small, but meaningful, because for the first time since the moment began on Maple Avenue, he was no longer trying to control the situation. He was standing within it, aware of it, and as the screen behind Marcus continued to display the collected truth, the room no longer felt like a place of authority alone. It felt like a place where something had been uncovered, something that would not be hidden again. And in that quiet, steady moment, the line between power and accountability became clearer than it had ever been before. The room did not return to normal after that moment, because something had already changed too deeply to be undone. And as the screen dimmed slightly, leaving the final frame of collected evidence lingering in quiet silence, Marcus Reed stepped back from it, not as someone stepping away from a task, but as someone allowing the truth to stand on its own, and the two federal agents exchanged a brief glance, a silent acknowledgement that what needed to be seen had been seen, what needed to be understood had been laid out without force, without exaggeration, just clarity, and that clarity now rested in the room like a weight no one could ignore. Officer Daniel Brooks remained where he stood, but his posture had shifted again, not just from authority to reflection, but from reflection to something closer to awareness, something that did not come easily, something that required him to see beyond procedure and into impact. And that was not something training manuals prepared you for. It was something you either faced or avoided, and Daniel was no longer avoiding it. "There is one more thing," Marcus said quietly, breaking the silence not to add pressure, but to complete what had begun, and his voice carried differently now, not just as an investigator, but as someone who had stood on both sides of the moment, who had felt the weight of assumption before it was ever spoken. The taller agent nodded slightly, stepping back to give Marcus the space to speak, and the room seemed to narrow its focus again, attention, settling not on the screen, not on the files, but on the man who had been brought in as a suspect just minutes ago. "When I was stopped today," Marcus continued, his tone steady, measured, "there was no evidence, no report that matched me, no reason beyond what was assumed." And he did not raise his voice, he did not emphasize the words, because he did not need to. The truth in them was enough. "That moment is not rare," he added, his eyes moving briefly across the room, acknowledging the officers present, not accusing them, but including them in something larger than this single event. "It happens quietly, quickly, and often without question." And those words did not land as an attack. They landed as recognition, the kind that does not demand a response but invites one. Daniel listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on Marcus now, not with resistance, not with defensiveness, but with attention, real attention, the kind that had been missing before. "The difference today," Marcus said, pausing for just a second, "is that you are seeing it from the outside." And that line carried a different kind of weight, because it shifted perspective. It turned the moment into something observable, something undeniable, and Daniel felt that shift fully. The memory of the street, the flashing lights, the crowd, all of it replaying in his mind, but now from a different angle, not as the one giving commands, but as the one being watched, and that perspective changed everything. "You cannot correct what you refuse to see," Marcus finished, his voice calm, final, and the room remained silent again, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been spoken. The second agent stepped forward slightly, his tone returning to formal procedure. "The next steps will be documented," he said, "and all involved parties will be notified accordingly." But even those words, structured and official, carried the weight of what had just unfolded, because this was no longer just a process, it was a turning point. Sergeant Collins gave a slow nod, his earlier neutrality now replaced with something closer to understanding. While the other officers remained quiet, their attention lowered, not out of dismissal, but out of reflection. And Daniel finally took a small step forward, not toward the door, not toward the exit, but into the space he had been standing outside of just moments ago. And that step, small as it was, meant more than anything he had said so far, because it showed that he was no longer observing from a distance. He was present, fully, in what this moment required. Marcus watched him for a brief second, then gave a slight nod, acknowledging not who Daniel had been when the sirens first sounded, but who he might become after this moment. And as the agents began to organize the files, preparing to move forward with the investigation, the station itself felt different, not quieter, not louder, but clearer, as if something that had been hidden in plain sight was now impossible to ignore. And in that clarity, the line between authority and responsibility no longer blurred. It stood sharp and defined, waiting for those who carried it to decide what they would do next. The station did not erupt into noise after everything was revealed. It did not need to, because the silence itself carried more weight than any reaction ever could. And as the agents began gathering their files and preparing the next phase of the investigation, the atmosphere settled into something steady, something grounded in clarity rather than confusion, and Marcus Reed stood near the center of it all, not as the man who had been brought in under suspicion, but as the one who had quietly allowed the truth to surface, his posture unchanged, his presence calm, as if the storm that had passed through the room had always been expected, and now that it had arrived, there was nothing left to force, nothing left to prove. Officer Daniel Brooks remained a few steps away, his gaze no longer shifting or searching, but fixed, focused in a way that suggested something deeper than simple realization, something closer to understanding, and that difference mattered. Because realization can fade, but understanding stays, it settles in. It reshapes how you see what comes next. What happens now? Daniel asked finally, his voice steady, not defensive, not resistant, but genuine, and the question did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like someone asking for direction in a place where the old map no longer worked. The taller agent glanced at Marcus briefly before answering. Now, everything moves forward, he said, his tone calm but firm. The review continues, the findings are documented, and decisions are made based on facts, not assumptions. And those words did not carry anger. They carried structure, the kind that replaces uncertainty with process. Marcus turned slightly toward Daniel, his expression thoughtful, not judging, not forgiving, simply present. And for you, Marcus added quietly, this is where the choice begins. And Daniel listened, fully this time, not waiting to respond, not preparing a defense, just listening. You can treat this as something that happened to you, Marcus continued, his voice even, or something that changed how you see everything after it. And the distinction settled between them, clear and undeniable, because one path led back to the same patterns, the same assumptions, while the other required something harder, something deeper, the willingness to question what had once felt automatic. Daniel nodded slowly, the movement deliberate, as if acknowledging not just the words, but the weight behind them. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to fill the space. Everything that mattered had already been said. The second agent stepped toward the door, opening it with a quiet motion, signaling that the moment inside this room was coming to a close, but not the impact of it, that would continue far beyond these walls. Sergeant Collins stood just outside, his posture straight, his expression serious. And as the group began to move back into the main station area, the difference was immediate, not in sound, but in awareness. Officers who had once moved through routine now carried a subtle pause in their actions, a moment of thought before motion, as if something had shifted in how they saw the space they worked in every day. Marcus walked toward the exit without urgency, his role in this moment complete, yet his presence still leaving an impression that would not fade easily. Daniel followed a few steps behind, not out of obligation, but because something in him was still processing, still turning over what had been revealed. And as they reached the front doors, the late afternoon light filtered in, softer now, stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines. Marcus paused just before stepping outside, turning slightly, not to address the room, not to make a statement, but to look once more at the space where everything had changed. and then he stepped forward into the light, leaving behind a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with understanding. And Daniel stood there for a moment longer, watching the door close, feeling the weight of his badge not as a symbol of control, but as a reminder of responsibility. And in that quiet, steady realization, one truth remained, clear and unshaken. He thought he was the law, but that day, he learned the law was something you had to live, not just wear.